All right, greetings, class. Welcome back. We're going to finish up now with the second half of the sexual marketplace chapter. And we talked a lot about pornography in the first video. In this video, we're going to talk about prostitution. So, just a reminder, right? When searching for a definition of something like pornography, it's any sexually explicit work that is obscene according to legal criteria. So, if you look up the legal criteria, obscenity, or what's obscene is any sexual behavior that is obscene, helpful, disgusting, foul, immoral, or blasphemous. So again, completely subject. Pornography in legal terms is any sexually explicit work deemed obscene according to legal criteria and therefore exempt from freedom of speech protections. And that goes for prostitution work as well. Um, and kind of the definitions for what prostitution um, is interesting, I think, to say the least. And it's illegal to engage in, to promote, or to profit from prostitution. All those things are illegal. And it's really sexual services that are exchanged for anything. It doesn't have to be money, it can be for any type of other service where sex is used as one of those currencies. Um, and like I said before, we looked at some of the history of prostitution. I read a little excerpt from Gilgamesh, and historically, it's been thought of as and legally defined as, in some places still is only defined this way, as acts furnished by a female for or to a male. But we need to expand that a little bit. That lacks nuance. That's not very complex. So first things first, prostitute is not what sex workers typically want to be called. Even sex worker isn't. It's kind of falling out of favor a bit lately, but that's still kind of the common term used for somebody that charges some type of service or does some kind of bartering using sex. But I thought it'd be interesting to look at types of prostitution or types of sex workers. Oh, and by the way, I posted a link to a podcast on our Canvas page and also in the announcements if you want to hear from a sex worker. Yeah, I listened to that one about a year ago. It's been a little while, but she'd done different types of sex work and has some insight into like these different industries that we're going to talk about now. But none of it, except for a couple of things she did, was like completely legal, right? So different states have different laws. The federal law doesn't change much, but different states have different laws. So, as you may well know, famously, in parts of Nevada, brothels are legal. So we'll talk about that, right? So there are some differences state to state. But check out that podcast if you want to. It's hosted by a comedian. I would say he doesn't ask always the most insightful questions, but sometimes naive questions are better than those asked by like the academic or the intellectual. Not to say he isn't smart. He just asks different types of questions. So check that one out if you want to. It's a little lengthy, so give yourself some time if you want to sit down and listen to that. I found it to be pretty interesting. Okay, so let's look at some different types of sex workers. And I think it's important to point out when we talk about these different types of sex workers is kind of like who they typically are and the risks involved with this particular type of sex work, right? So first we've got street walkers. There's like it sounds, sell services on the street, and they're at the greatest danger of all sex workers for things like addiction and for other types of emotional and physical abuse. Um, I mean, going so far as to be murdered. Um, so that's the most dangerous, and we'll say some more about them in a bit. And then we've got call girls, right? So often when I teach this class, some students will make jokes. They'll hear like about like sugar daddies and sugar babies, and they'll think, okay, I just have to date this older guy for a time and he'll pay my way through college kind of thing. And I think it sounds funny and it sounds good. Um, Their differences: call girls tend to see fewer clients compared to streetwalkers, who typically see the most. Call girls charge more. They typically charge the most out of just about all of these, these different select groups of sex workers. And they're contacted when their services are desired, that type of thing. And they usually have repeat business, right? So I have some friends who are sex workers, and they've done a series of these things. They've been streetwalkers and call girls. I've never had a friend that was a brothel worker, and they had some insight. So it sounds funny to make a joke like, oh, I need a sugar daddy to take care of me. All I have to do is like maybe not even have sex with the person. Well, that is, I was asking my friend about that. That is completely uncommon. And so she definitely didn't make light of the like the sugar daddy, sugar baby kind of relationship when I asked her about it. And I think the woman in the video says the same thing. She said it was her least favorite, and it was more dangerous than people think to be a call girl, especially if it's that type of relationship with like a one person that's like lengthy over amount of time. She said because of most of these, like if you're a call girl or a brothel worker, there's like paperwork involved. It's like, here's the deal, here's what you get, here's how much it costs, and then when it's over, right? But when you're like a sugar baby, she said that it's all gray area, and you never get to stop kind of performing, and you kind of can lose yourself and your own sense of identity kind of in the character you're playing. And then you start to form a relationship with this other person just from sheer contact, increased contact. And pretty soon they start to try to barter, where they'll try to get more and more stuff that is outside of their comfort zone as a sex worker, and the person wants to pay less and less. So they want to pay less and less for more and more, right? Or in the other types of sex work, it's like, here's what you get for this much. And she said that was much more preferable. And you could pretend to like it or not, and it didn't matter as much. Where if you were a sugar baby, it's like you were always performing nonstop, sometimes for a weekend to a week on end. And it could be exhausting, and you walk out with less money than some of the other sex workers. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that kind of thing before. All right, so call girls safer than streetwalkers, but still different. Fewer clients that charge more, and they're typically contacted by other clients that get more repeat business from the same clients as well. Okay, then we have brothel workers. So brothel workers like this one, I think this one is closed now, the Shady Lady Ranch. I might be wrong about that. Sometimes these are called house prostitutes, and they typically will share their fees, like a percentage of their cut, let's say, with a house manager or a madam, right, who kind of serves as the manager of the premises, but sometimes and typically the finances as well. These tend to be safer practices, definitely, than streetwalkers, and often more safer than for call girls, who are usually going out to hotels, things like that. And so safer practices where the clients come to the brothel, like the Shady Lady Ranch, kind of like outskirts of town kind of thing. And they're much less likely to, well, first of all, it's regulated by the state. So these workers are not allowed to work, if they have STIs. So there's safer practices already, where, of course, if they're call girls or streetwalkers, you have no idea, right? And also, you're not allowed to have sex. You're not allowed to go in as a customer, if you refuse to take a test for STIs, or if you have STIs. So it's safer that way, in that regard. Um, Take Nevada, for example. Not only is prostitution legal, but it's become like big business, right? And although brothels in Nevada are required by law to be inconspicuous, often the opposite is true. If you guys ever been to Nevada, maybe you can see for yourself. This brothel, the Shady Lady, it's in Nye County, Nevada, and it may require a name change now that's been approved to add male prostitutes to service female customers. So recently, but I thought I remember reading it was closed, but they did add male prostitutes in. Okay, speaking of male prostitutes, sometimes they're called gigolos or male escorts, hustlers, but they sell their services just like female sex workers do, primarily to other men. Although some male prostitutes do sell their services to women, it's typically not an industry where there are a lot of women um, who want to be with a male sex worker. There's women that want to be with other women to try it, women that want to go in with their partners, but typically not, one female customer going in for one male sex worker. It happens, but it's pretty rare. Most of the business for male sex workers is other males. So with the gigolos, their sex work is also linked to various drug abuse and health issues. Excuse me. They tend to have high rates of STIs. And if you want to compare like male prostitutes to female prostitutes, just like by sheer number, how many can be identified, which is harder to do now. But when it was a little easier a few years ago, you could say about a third of sex workers were male. So that means 2/3 female. About that, right? Okay, now the male prostitutes, the reason why their STI rates are higher is because when surveyed, you may take that with a grain of salt, I think, but with the surveys for male sex workers, they tend to say they don't use any type of protection as often as the female sex workers do. And then they're often having anal sex with clients. And just because of the tissues in the anus are more sensitive, more likely to rupture and tear and break, then they're more likely to spread STIs that way. So that's why those numbers tend to be a bit higher. Okay. So let's look at who becomes a prostitute. So I have a few stats here I got out of your book that are kind of interesting. So, I want to talk about the backgrounds of prostitutes a little bit. Um, Life experiences do not by any means fully explain the motivations, but they're worth looking at anyway, right? So there's a chronological sequence of drug use in prostitution. You can kind of see in this graph here. So on the bottom on the x-axis, it says average age of sex trade worker. So 13 all the way up to 22, right? And here's some events, from their lives, like first drug use, 15 and a half, right? Regular sexual activity, 16.2 years old, regular drug use, 17 and a half. So what's different is like the regular sexual activity is not very different from the general population. Um, Neither is first drug use. It's a little bit earlier, but not much. I don't think it's statistically significant. Regular drug use, though, is, that's about 17 and a half using drugs regularly. First IV drug use, 19.9, so about 20 years old. That's interesting because it's hard to compare to the general population tends to be a little bit older for that one. But it doesn't tell you here either, like how many sex workers do these things at all, right? Like regular IV drug use. You see it more in streetwalkers than the other types of sex workers. First prostitution, about 20, 21 years old. And then regular prostitution, just about a year later, right? So it doesn't take long to kind of get into the business. I could say this too for like a lot of women who were like surveyed, men too, but there's more surveys on women sex workers. A lot of them say they would rather be doing something else than sex work, especially when they're asked young. But a lot of them also have positive things to say, right? I think they got that on a graph coming up here soon. Where they would, the biggest benefit they cite for the type of work they do is that they really can make their own schedules. Like it's super flexible. All right, but who becomes a prostitute? So here's a comparison of sex workers to a comparison group of non-sex workers. So first, penile penetration. This graph makes it look really, really big. Like the difference is really big. It's 2 years. It's about 14 years for a sex worker and 16 years for non-sex workers. Um, that's a big 2 years, I suppose, though, in terms of psychological development, but not very big, like chronologically, right? And the first consensual sex, no different. Like this makes it look like it's different. It's 1 year, 15 to 16. And then regular sexual activity, 16 to 17. Not a big difference there either. Okay, so if the differences are not really there here, like when they're first having sex, that's not really related to who does or doesn't become a sex worker. It's like, well, what is, right? It's taking account a lot of the different social facets of life, right? So things like poverty. So there's a correlation between poverty and sex work, right? There's a correlation between child abuse and sex work. And then you have all these other mediating and moderating correlators, corollaries around the outside of, this kind of halo around prostitution itself. Early sexual initiation. This one I think should not be included since we just saw in the last graph that it doesn't seem like that's a factor. Um, Barring, you know, uh, child abuse. So what this is really referring to, it's a little misleading, is where this person who became a sex worker, they're initiating sex often when they're younger, right? But again, not at a different age than people who are not sex workers. So then there's the drug addiction, and that tends to be uh, a big mediating factor between poverty and prostitution. So if you take all of these things into account, you still have a very low predictability rate of who is or isn't a sex worker, but you have a pretty high predictability rate of those people who partake in unhealthy sexual activity, just whether they're getting paid or not, right? So that's something to consider. It's not simple. It's not just when did you have sex. It's also abuse, poverty, drug addiction, all these things, co-factor together to help predict like who will or won't be or who is or who isn't a sex worker. Okay. So I put a video up on our Canvas page about sex trafficking. And the numbers, like if you look at the statistics on sex trafficking, it will blow your mind. Just how much more common it is than most people think, right? And so sex trafficking, what that really refers to is essentially it's a form of slavery, right? Where you totally rely on somebody else to use you and your body and your sexuality to make money, right? And you get to a point where you're totally dependent on that person. Um, of course, there's coercion and manipulation, that psychological bent. And then there's also the economic, where a lot of the children in particular who get abducted or coerced into sex trafficking is because they make more money doing that than, you know, other types of jobs. I mean, not even be other jobs or career options where they're currently living. And so they have to think, do I do this? Because if I do this, it means that maybe my siblings don't have to, and I can contribute to the family and I can make money, right? And so often they'll keep it quiet or it's encouraged by their families. Um, it's really, really sad and, of course, dangerous. Here's some statistics for you. Like, most detected victims are female. Women account for, just a little bit over half of all trafficking victims, detected on a global scale. And this is looking at age, right? So we have adults and then we have male adults. And then when you look at children, though, there's a big difference, right? Where like 20% who are that can be identified are female, 8% male, right? So if we're wondering, okay, when thinking about sex trafficking, like where are people being trafficked from? Where are they going? Right? Here's a map to kind of give you an idea about kind of the nationalities of these victims or survivors if they actually get out. And you can see most of these, in this case, most of these people are coming from Africa. You have some East Asian, South American in there, in North America and Central America, right, or in the Caribbean. There's also high levels of sex trafficking in the Middle East too. So if you try to follow these lines, right, this down here, if you get a dashed line, it says flows of 1% less of detective victims at destination. So you can see where people are going to and from. A lot of sex trafficking is going to Central and Western Europe, a lot to the Middle East, and a lot to right here in North America. Yeah, those are the three major destinations, right? North America and Central America and the Caribbean areas, um, and then like I said before, Western and Central Europe and the Middle East. Um, Go watch the video I put up if you want to learn more about sex trafficking, and if you want to get involved in stopping sex trafficking, or just types of issues with domestic and sexual assault, uh, please consider joining the Consent Project, Bakersfield College. I've got the links up there on Canvas as well. I'm one of the co-advisors for that club. Come check it out. Right, we're going through trainings currently, and they might be interesting to you. Okay, now let's look at prostitution and STIs. So the idea of prostitution and trafficking in particular is that the question becomes, is prostitution a choice, right? And for many people who are sex workers, the majority of them, it is not a choice for them. They're coerced, manipulated. They feel like they can't get out. Some of them are just completely enslaved, right? For those that it is their choice, I think that's a different story. And we're primarily talking about kind of a mixed bag right now of some of the stats I'm going to throw you, right? Some of them may be forced, into prostitution and sex trafficking, and there may be threats to them or their family of like bodily harm or economic harm. They may be coerced into street walking. Well, the stats can think of significantly increased risk of rape and other sexual violence and of drug abuse. But it's getting harder and harder to collect this data um, because of new laws, frankly, that are there to protect sex workers, but also make it a lot harder to track data on, sex trafficking and, health, all the stats that we used to collect before 2018. All right. But that's part of your discussion assignment. Go check out your discussion assignment. You'll get some more insight about those laws and how they affected sex work both positive and negative ways. Okay. So the highest risk sex worker are streetwalkers, and in particular, transvestite male streetwalkers. So if you're wondering, like, well, why might that be? If you just kind of break down, the demographic categories of a transvestite male streetwalker, then you might understand why. Okay, well, first of all, streetwalking, is the most dangerous of the sex worker categories. And then if you look at male versus female for like STI rates, it's much higher for males. So if you combine streetwalking and men, here you are, right? You've got transvestite male streetwalkers. So the two highest risk behaviors: unprotected sexual activities, sharing drug paraphernalia, unprotected sex, drugs leads to STIs, right? So far more common among streetwalkers, and especially male transvestite prostitutes who impersonate women and service men. Okay, the lowest risk are the brothel workers I talked about earlier. Brothel workers, they have this reduced rate due to condom use and like insistent condom use. Like, since it's all regulated by some kind of state agency, typically, then or government agency, if you break the rules, then you're kicked out and then you're banned, right? You can't go back, and so people don't break the rules as often, or you just won't be serviced. They have depending where you are. I was reading about people trying to sue brothels to get their money back because they would Oh man, I forgot the term for it, but they would slip their condoms off while they're having sex and trying to go undetected. And then when they got told that was against the rules and kicked out and not given refunds, then they would try to sue and they'd say, no, that's our policy, right? You broke the rules. And in some countries that meant jail time for doing something like that because you put the health of somebody else in danger, right? You put somebody else at risk. So that's interesting. So the brothels typically promote sexual health among their sex workers, encourage and promote condom use. They have routine screenings for STIs, um, and they have access to retroviral therapies. So they tend to be the safest because they're regulated. That's kind of interesting. There's other things too, like they look at some sociological data, like in countries that have brothels, they'll look at rates of specific types of crimes before and after the brothels are introduced. They see things like domestic violence go down. They see alcohol sales go down. Kind of interesting, right? Like when you create some new for wave of sexual expression in an area, what about all this like pent up anxiety that their clients may have dealt with in some other unhealthy way, that they'll go see sex workers instead. I don't know. It's a moral judgment. I don't know if you think that's healthy or not. It's certainly not the way we do things here where we live. So it feels kind of taboo and foreign. But um, the stats are there, right? If you look at Australia before and afterward, you see violent crime go down, domestic violence go down, rates of DUIs decrease. It's like, interesting. So when there's like this outlet for these clients, um, maybe that serves as some kind of anxiety reduction and makes life easier for them somehow. Like it's some kind of like coping mechanism. I don't know. But that's up to you, right? It's like a moral thing to think about. All right. So speaking of the people that visit these brothels, who are they, right? So who are the clients of prostitutes? And there's information on that too. It's all going to be old information now since we're not allowed to collect this information anymore. Um, Thanks to Fosta Sesta. So, who goes to see these sex workers? Sometimes they're called John, sometimes they're called tricks, right, or clients. They're soliciting the services of prostitutes, by the way, is a misdemeanor, right? But if you want to know, the characteristics of these clients are mostly employed, middle to upper class, educated, heterosexual, married men. That's who sees the sex workers the most. And what do they want? That's a question I'm anticipating people wondering. What do they typically want? The most commonly purchased activity is fellatio or blowjobs, right? That's usually what they want. But they really say they're paying for is like a brief, uncomplicated sexual encounter. That's really what they want. But what's interesting is that I have friends who are sex workers. I have friends that have gone to sex workers. I have neither done either, so I can't speak from my own experience. But I know from some of my friends that have gone to sex workers, they either liked it or didn't like it for how kind of like how much of a business transaction it was, right? They wanted like something you pay a lot more for. You might call like the girlfriend experience. Like you want like a call girl or like some really expensive sex worker at a brothel, and they're paying not very much money. And I guess you get what you pay for, right? Um, so I remember my friend telling me, he's like, yeah, I had to put a condom on, which I didn't expect. And I was like, yeah, they're looking out for their health, man. They don't know you, right? I was like, so I think you're being a little unrealistic there, and he's like, and then they put a glove on, and then they just kind of masturbated me. And I thought, okay, and she's like, and he was like, the woman didn't even seem like she was into it. She didn't care. We were talking about the news and this kind of thing. I'm going, it's bizarre, man. Doesn't seem to like it would work for me, but it worked for him, and he's gone all over the world, paying for these types of services. Um, from my friends that are sex workers, I've had a couple. They have some really interesting things to share about that line of work. Most of let's see, I'm thinking of like four different individuals, and only one of them still is in that industry. The others, they said, as they kind of got older, that there was just less and less money in it for them unless you found some kind of niche, right? So I was talking to one of my friends, and um, she said the problem with it as an industry from her point of view was that now that women had like online shows, they just have to have a laptop or just a camera, and then you can be a sex worker, right? She said the problem is though that you make a lot less money now than you would when she started, which was like the early 2000s. She said now you'll get these girls who will do more extreme things for way less money, and it just changes the market for everybody. I thought, that's interesting. And she was like, there's things I'm just not willing to do, have boundaries that I wouldn't do even though I'm a sex worker. And certainly not for that little money. I was like, interesting. And so she stopped for a while, but then she got a couple of clients who sought her out specifically. And so now she does a thing called financial humiliation. So she has like extremely rich clients who she humiliates, and they get off on that, right? It's like their fetish. So she humiliates them and they pay her for it. And she does it online. She never has to touch them. She says two of them, she's never even seen their face. So I thought that's interesting. So for her, it's like a win-win. She's like, I don't have to have sex with these people, and I get way more money than I used to. Turns out she's just a good actress, right? And so she's really good at being dominating and humiliating these guys. Interesting, huh? My question was, who are these guys that have so much money, right? And she won't tell me, of course, because she's a professional. But she'd say, you would know a couple of them if I told you their name. They're that famous. I thought, no. So now I just want to know even more. Some of the other people I know that did sex work have different types of stories. Like one woman did, she was in a couple of pornographic movies, and her story is pretty horrendous. She talks about the women in the movies, some of them loving every minute of it, like it's the perfect job for them. They seem happy. But she said, and then that was about half, and then the other half, she said, were kind of like stuporous because on the drugs they were on, they were kind of in a daze and lost in life and that kind of thing, and very sad stories. Another friend of mine, she was a dominatrix, and she did really interesting stuff. Like just lots of stories. She once participated in a full Klingon wedding. She had to learn Klingon. And they have like, I guess, like some kind of mating rituals part of the wedding. And this guy wanted to reenact like all of this. And she made tons of money doing that. And I thought that was interesting. I always asked all of them, like, would you go back and do it again? And my friend who did pornography said, no way. My friend who was learning Klingon and that kind of thing, she was like, sure. Right. But most times she wasn't actually having sex with these men. Once in a while she did. And she was like, I'd rather not. I was like, okay. My friend who does the financial domination, she says she'd go back in a heartbeat if the market was the way it used to be. So I thought, that's interesting. Okay, so prostitution, the legalization of prostitution, or the decriminalization. So this is an interesting one, right? Like prostitution in the law. Legalization means, of course, it's completely legal, right? Like you see in this picture here, like the red light district. And then other cases, you have the decriminalization. So it's removal of criminal laws relating to prostitution. And the debate is often extremely contentious. In Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where prostitution is legal, they have fewer of criminal, health, and human trafficking problems that exist in other countries where prostitution is illegal. And that's usually what they argue. They say we provide this service and it keeps everybody else safer. There's less of a black market, like a hidden underground market for this type of service because everything's above ground and it's easier to monitor. And that's kind of one of the arguments against the FOFTA SESTA that I want you guys to do for your discussion is that when you make these things illegal on the internet to such an extent, then it drives everybody underground. And then you have no idea about the statistics. It gets harder to avoid the problem if you're a citizen because you don't know what to look for because it's all hidden. And it makes it more dangerous for the sex workers as well because they used to use those pages, to talk to each other, to say, this person, don't ever see them, right? So they would talk to my friends in sex work too, and this is exactly what they do. They would flag certain people. They had profiles of them, and they said, this person contacts you, do not service them, avoid them because they're dangerous, right? And then the new laws made it impossible for them to do that. So on the one hand, you get this like sweeping, brush of morality that says all of this is bad. And even if this is the work you want to do, we want to take it away and you can no longer do it. We'll make it harder to do that, because we want to stop human trafficking, right? Which is a noble thing to do, right? You want to stop people from being enslaved, of course. But how do you do that without also harming those that want to be in the business, who are consenting and old enough to do so? Well, we passed laws that basically just said, too bad, right? And so it made it more dangerous for them too. And so all that gets pushed underground. That's one side of the argument, right? The other side says they should find something better to do with their time anyway. Even if they want to do this, they shouldn't want to and shouldn't be allowed to. So it's a weird argument. We go back and forth on this. But other countries certainly have taken, made different decisions than we have in our country, right? You go to Australia or certain parts of Europe, right, where it's still decriminalized or completely legal. Okay, so make sure that you do the quiz and the discussion assignment for this chapter. And I hope I gave you some things to think about. Maybe this chapter wasn't all you thought it would be, but we covered quite a bit. There's more we could talk about, but I feel like that's enough for now. And I will see you next time. Have a good one.